This PowerPoint is designed to help students who are studying Chaucer with me for their AS level in the new OCR A-level syllabus. It is relevant to anybody studying Chaucer at any age, and to be honest, I might even use it in Year 7, where many of the students at John Lyon will be reading some Chaucer as soon as they arrive at the school. It's designed to tie in with the screencasts and blog posts that have already been made, but also to deliver a specific training, if you like, or introduction, probably, to the idea of the metre, the poetry that Chaucer is writing, and to look at some of the more distinctive elements of his poetic style, as seen in the Merchant's Tale. So the first thing I want to look at is the metre that Chaucer adopted. The metre of a poem is the fundamental rhythm, if you like, of the poem. We can think of it, if we're musicians, as the way beats and bars form to give music, if you like, a rhythmical pulse, something of that nature. And any class that I deliver this PowerPoint to will be asked at this point whether or not they can sing the opening of the Pink Panther theme. And I think just about everybody sitting here can. I will pause the screencast, or rather you should probably pause the screencast if you wish to, just while you think about the Pink Panther theme. But once you've done that, of course, we all know da-dum, 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 and that's all we need, the first 5 units, shall we say, of the Pink Panther. We don't need to worry about ba-dum, 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 or anything of that nature. We just want da-dum, 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 da-dum. Because this tune, Henry Mancini's Pink Panther theme, rather wonderfully captures the typical unstressed-stressed pairing that makes up a unit of metre, which is called, from the ancient Greek, an iamb. You have absolutely no need to worry about why it's called an iamb. I would just like you to remember that it is. It's often written, as I say, with a little X and a slash or a dash and a slash, the slash being the stressed syllable of the pair. Da-dum. And when you look at my little segment of the tune across the top of the page there, you'll see there are 5 of these paired units. 5 iambs in a line is an iambic pentameter. Penta from the Greek for 5, meter, the rhythm of the poem. It's a 5 meter iambic line full of iambs. Thus, the mathematicians amongst you will be far ahead of me, and you will have worked out that there are 10 syllables in a line of iambic pentameter. Now, Chaucer is one of the earliest poets writing, if not the earliest poet that we would ever read, if you like. There are others writing in what is recognisably English. And he is using, through the Canterbury Tales, largely iambic pentameter. He hasn't always used this in his writing career, but at this stage, this verse form is beginning to develop. He writes, or he tends to write, in rhymed couplets, and these are generally termed, therefore, heroic couplets when they form the basis of a whole poem. Thus, if you tell somebody that a poem is written in heroic couplets, they will automatically know that these are iambic pentameters in rhyming couplet groups. Each pair of syllables, each iamb, if you like, is termed a foot within the poem. Thus, there are 5 feet in a line, and the 5 feet in iambic pentameter are all iambs. And this will become the great form of poetry throughout English literature, certainly up to the 17th century. And it will grow and grow in sophistication, and writers that you will come to later in the course, writers such as Shakespeare, writers like John Milton, great writers later on in English literature will be using this verse form in order to create their poetry. And you might wonder why, or what effect this has. And I've chosen a line here to look at. This is line 56. If we count the syllables, we'll notice that we have to not pronounce the E at the end of the word tuck as a separate syllable. It just allides with the A there. To tuck, awif, it is a glorious thing. And we know in the context of the poem, if we've read it, that this line already from line 56 is a line dripping in irony and possibly in sarcasm. I talked in an earlier screencast about this area of the poem and, if you like, the changing emphasis on these lines, all depending on who you think is actually speaking to us at the time. But when we look at this in the context of poetry, first of all, there's a wonderful crescendo through this line, da-dum, 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 da-dum. So we head off to Tataka Wif. It is a glorious thing. That word glorious coming there as it does in the fourth foot seems to be led to by the whole of the rest of the line. If this were set to music, it would be a crescendo throughout it. But we also notice that the stresses in the line allow us to recognize that the word is needs to be stressed, as well as the first syllable of the word glorious, that word that gives itself to glory and to sort of wondrousness. But it's as though the word is needs to be emphasized. Maybe people doubt it. Tatakawif, it is a glorious thing, somehow gives more weight, more conviction to the line because of the way the poetry falls. Again, 2 lines later in line 58, this little unit comes to a close with Chaucer saying, "Than is a whiff the fruit of his tresor." And here we see that the middle of the line, the third stress, if you like, is the musical high point of the line. The alliteration allows that to happen. The fruit takes the time to deliver the word. And it's right at the midpoint of the line, "Than is a whiff the fruit of his tresor." And we might wonder, why has Chaucer chosen to write the line in this way? In what way, this is a question for you to consider before you move on, does the word fruit here increase the irony of the passage? Pause the screencast, think about it, have some ideas, and then come back. Assuming you've come back, what have we got? The irony surely is pointed here. Whoever the narrator is at this point, if it's January, certainly, when he thinks of the fruit of his tresor, he's thinking of harvest, he's thinking of fertility, he's thinking of growth, he's thinking of natural bounty and the way that things reproduce and so on. The high point of all his wealth. Being January, of course, he relates it to wealth rather than love. But the narrator, if it's another narrator, particularly if it's Chaucer, if it's the reader, the listener, we hear other things. Because we hear the connotations, we hear the echoes of Eve and apples, we hear, if we've read the tale as a whole, we hear the echo of the fruit tree in the private garden, we hear the echo of May's craving for prayers, the fruit of his tresor, we hear the ideas of pregnancy in here as well, and many other ideas of this nature, all of which help to point up the irony of the alleged high moment of wonder or pleasure at the concept of a wife being undercut by the other ideas contained in that word. You should always remember at this stage that no word ever appears on a page by accident in a poem. The iambic pentameter is also a good rhythm because it is generally found to be very close to the speech rhythm of natural speech, which makes total sense in a poem like the Canterbury Tales. This is allegedly a group of people from a wide range of backgrounds talking to each other as they travel to Canterbury. And it makes total sense that the rhythmic tread, the pulse of the poetry represents the pulse of speech. And it's worth here again seeing what little tricks can be pulled. I'm going to go to the other end of the poem here, and one of the lines that I'm sure, whether I like it or not, the boys I teach will remember, if only because of content rather than context. And suddenly anon this dam Ian gan pullen up the smock and in he throng. This moment of coitus, the moment of rape, and it's not rape, is it? The moment of sexual intercourse, of congress in the pear tree. One of the things I've talked about elsewhere is how there's very obviously little real, if you like, emotional link between Damian and May. And here we see this absolutely in the speed and the urgency of this line. There's an enjambment across the lines as Damian gun pulling up the smock, no pause, no hesitation, ripping the clothes. And the little caesura after smock, which is accentuated by that K at the end of the word. We have this harsh glottal K sound, a smock. We have to stop there before the double force in the stresses of in and throng, showing the violence of his action as he takes May. in the tree. Absolutely brilliant writing. So we will talk about the poetry and the nature of the poetry, the form of the poetry, the structure of the poetry as we read at length. But I want to just think of the forms of the writing a little as well and just introduce some ideas here. Broadly speaking, there are three sort of stylistic features, if you like, in this text. We have realistic writing, what I'm calling fantastic writing, the writing of myth or legend, and symbolism, symbolic writing. And the table here, which I've lifted quite unashamedly from rather a good study guide published by Pearson on this text, allows you to take the ideas and begin to fill in your own thoughts. Realism. We've got place, setting, description of appearance, lust and disgust. So the descriptions of place are descriptions of the palace where the wedding's taking place. The little descriptions of Pavia as the setting of the poem itself. Little descriptions of the setting in the garden. Descriptions of appearance, probably most commonly relating to the wonderful realism of the slack skin hanging around January's neck and so on. You can look for yourself at descriptors of lust and disgust and find any more. In terms of the fantastical, the fairies, the blindness, this miraculous blindness and again miraculous cure that will come about. There's something strangely sort of old world and sort of mythological almost, sort of Homeric about the formal debates around marriage. This could be taken from something like the Iliad and the arguments there about people being faithful or not between the gods. The outcome is comic, it's unlikely, it's swift, and again, not necessarily realistic. And obviously we also have this appearance of the Greek gods. In terms of the symbolism in the writing, obviously the names are highly symbolic. The blindness, we might decide, is also utterly symbolic as to whether or not January has actually been blind to reality throughout the whole poem. And then we have the garden, which I've discussed elsewhere, and within the garden, the pear tree. So this is for you to do your work with and to start to develop and to build quotation banks, revision banks that you will remember. Another stylistic quirk of the whole Canterbury Tales, but actually particularly this tale, and maybe it's because the merchant is wishing, or rather Chaucer wishes the merchant to be perceived as a knowledgeable man. The narrator is knowledgeable, and in order to show this, most of the narrators in the tales, and particularly here, either the merchant himself or January, depending on the nation of the narration, uses authorities, well-known authors. And again, I'm not going to give you them all here, you can find them, but we have here the Bible, Seneca, Cato, Ovid, Claudian, all coming, if you like, from the world of literature, most specifically actually Roman literature. There's a lovely intertextual joke that the wife of Bath is referred to as a source. There are folk sayings and legend running through the story, and these often take the form of what are known as Proverbs or Exempla. The Proverbs are sayings that have become so common to be taken as fact in modern English. We have, well, I don't know whether we do use sayings anymore like rolling stones gather no moss or too many cooks spoil the broth, but these are Proverbs. And there's a little one here that I've chosen on 148, 149, for which do always so as women well be read, this idea that if one wants a successful life, one must always do as women advise you. Now, it's typical that following a proverb, we should find some examples, or exempla, to give them the Latin term, to prove, if you like, the veracity of that proverb. And at this point in the poem, there's a digression as we get 4 examples of allegedly wise or well-behaved women, all taken from the Bible, all of whom actually are seen in some way to be husband deceivers, which of course adds to the level of irony of the whole tale, but which are there to prove the proverb. And this technique, derived from the great classical orators, people like Cicero, was used commonly in the pulpits of the day, where a sermon would be preached in which, if you like, a proverb or what was known as a sententia, a wise saying, would be produced. The most obvious one of these comes possibly from the Pardoner's tale, with the sententia radix malorum est cupiditas, the root of all sin is greed. And then that is followed by a series of examples in order to prove it. At the end of this sequence, in line 164, Chaucer, through his narrator, rounds off the digression with another proverb, and he gives it the authority of it coming from this Roman writer Seneca. There is nothing in grey superlative, as saith Seneca, above an humbler weath. This idea that the proverb itself, that there is nothing more important, if you like, in life than a humble wife, is given weight, truth, and power because it is attributed to the writer Seneca. In this way, Chaucer is establishing his own knowledge, but also, and particularly, the knowledge, if you like, and the authority of whoever the voice is that is narrating the poem at a given time. Lastly, a quick word about pace in The Merchant's Tale. This isn't an action tale. This isn't a tale in which a huge amount happens. There's an awful lot of discussion. There's an awful lot of philosophical argument, I use the word advisedly. And digressions are common, and they serve to delay the denouement of the stories. Certainly in the case of Pluto and Proserpina, that's the case. And with Placebo and Justinus, it's this philosophical argument that stops us getting to the actual wedding and allows us to some degree to explore the nature of a good wife. Once Chaucer gets to the end of his story, the actual action of the events in the garden, the climbing of the tree, the intercourse, the return of the sight, and the quickfire argument between May and January about the reasons for what he saw in the tree, all happen very, very fast and run the story down very efficiently, very effectively to its end. You'll notice 4 or 5 times during the tale the word suddenly appearing in Chaucer's writing. And it's interesting, I think, in this tale that suddenly, with the exception of the Damian moment that I referred to earlier in this talk, doesn't necessarily confer speed, but it sort of jumps the story forward after the great digressions or something of that nature. It often adds to the unreality of the narrative and develops this fantasy element, the unreal nature. It's suddenly that the blindness comes, and it's suddenly that the blindness goes away again, just like that. Unrealistic, and serving, if you like, to just kick the story on to the next phase. So, I hope that's given you some ideas to think about as you're reading in terms of the typical stylistic traits of Chaucer's writing in this poem, but also a basic introduction to the iambic pentameter and the poetry itself. I hope you found it useful, and I hope that you will enjoy continuing to work on Chaucer as we develop